There's something profoundly seismic about watching the polished over veneer of diplomacy suddenly fracture before our very eyes. The theatre of diplomacy, that grand stage where politicians and statesmen have for decades performed their carefully choreographed routines, fox smiles, rehearsed handshakes, and the endless dance of evasions has cracked open. It's no longer the realm of polite nods and coded language, where everyone is perpetually towing the line of carefully calibrated ambiguity. Instead, what's emerging is a raw, primal performance, where the scripted lines have been thrown out and the actors speak with a brutal honesty that disorients as much as it enlightens. Diplomacy was always meant to be the art of saying nothing while sounding like you're saying everything. It thrived on euphemisms, on the subtle, almost hypnotic art of obfuscation. The real business was always happening behind closed doors, in back channels and whispered conversations, where the truth was hidden beneath layers of tact and political expediency. But now, with JShankar's intervention, that polished facade has been shattered. The cracks reveal a world that is far messier, far more combustible than the sanitized versions we're used to seeing broadcasted on prime time news. What's fascinating here is the way this rupture exposes the fundamental contradictions embedded in modern diplomacy. It has long been a game rigged in favor of those who control the narrative, primarily Western powers with their entrenched institutions and media empires, who have had the luxury of defining the terms of global engagement. Diplomacy was their theatre, a well-rehearsed spectacle where the script served to maintain the status quo, to keep certain voices muted and others amplified. Yet when that script is torn apart and the stage lights shine on raw grievances and unapologetic demands, the whole production becomes unpredictable, even dangerous. This rupture challenges the very idea of diplomacy as a tool for peace and cooperation. It reminds us that diplomacy, as practiced for so long, has often been little more than a masquerade. Underneath the genteel language of partnership and mutual respect lies a battlefield of competing interests, a constant jockeying for power that rarely gets acknowledged in public discourse. What Shankar's boldness uncovers is that the so-called all rules-based international order is often a euphemism for preserving the dominance of those who have long benefited from it. And when that order is questioned so openly, it threatens the comfortable illusions upon which it is built. There is also something deeply symbolic about this cracking open, something that speaks to the post-colonial identity struggles many nations face today. For decades, diplomacy demanded conformity to Western norms, protocols, etiquette. Even the languages in which grievances could be expressed were dictated by those in power. The fracture in the diplomatic theatre signals a rejection of those imposed norms and a reclamation of voice and agency. It is an assertion that these nations will no longer be silent spectators or obedient players in a global script that ignores their realities. This moment also exposes the human element often lost in diplomatic performances. The polished smiles and rehearsed speeches often mask the pain, frustration, and urgency felt by those who have long been sidelined. When the cracks appear, it's like the fight peels back to reveal raw nerves and unresolved conflicts. It's a reminder that beneath the calm exterior, diplomacy is fueled by deeply emotional and historical wounds that polite discourse alone cannot heal. Moreover, this disruption forces the global audience to reconsider the way information flows and is consumed. The traditional gatekeepers of international discourse, the state-controlled media, the official press releases, are no longer the sole narrators. Social media, independent journalism, and real-time analysis bring immediacy and diversity to the conversation, making the diplomatic theatre more transparent but also more volatile. The cracks let in light but also let in chaos. In essence, this breaking apart of the diplomatic theatre invites us to witness something far more authentic, a messy, contested and vibrant dialogue that refuses to be sanitized or simplified. It is a call to engage with global affairs not as passive spectators, but as critical thinkers aware of the power dynamics and histories shaping every word spoken and every silence held. For centuries, the global stage has been dominated by a particular narrative, one that centers Western powers as the arbiters of order, progress, and legitimacy. This narrative has been so deeply embedded in international relations that it often masquerades as an objective truth rather than the product of centuries of power, conquest, and economic exploitation. Western hegemony, both overt and subtle, has dictated how countries interact, how conflicts are framed, and which voices are amplified or silenced. But now, for the first time in a very long while, this hegemonic grip is being publicly, unapologetically challenged. And that challenge is shaking the foundations of the so-called rules-based international order. The audacity of this challenge lies not only in its content but in its form. It is no longer whispered in corridors or couched in diplomatic niceties. It is declared openly, boldly, without the usual layers of euphemism. The very institutions and forums that were once platforms for Western dominance, be it the United Nations, international summits, or global economic forums, are witnessing a new breed of assertiveness. Representatives from post-colonial and emerging powers are using these stages not to nod politely or echo established doctrines, but to expose contradictions, hypocrisies, and the selective application of international laws and norms. This public challenge reveals a profound shift in the global balance of power. It signals that the once unassailable narrative of Western superiority is no longer accepted as universal. The voices rising up are reminding the world that history has multiple perspectives, that the trauma of colonization, resource extraction, and economic marginalization cannot be glossed over by platitudes about global cooperation. This is a reckoning, a demand that the global conversation account for the lived realities of billions outside the traditional Western power centers. What makes this moment particularly potent is the way it exposes the double standards underpinning Western policies. Whether it's the selective enforcement of sanctions, the framing of conflicts, or the disregard for sovereignty when convenient, these contradictions are now laid bare before the international community. The public challenge dismantles the myth that Western actions are always guided by universal values like democracy and human rights. Instead, it exposes these values as often contingent, instrumentalized to serve strategic interests. This confrontation also marks a broader ideological and cultural contestation. The Western worldview, shaped by Enlightenment ideals and capitalist liberalism, is being questioned by alternative visions that emphasize multipolarity, respect for sovereignty, and diverse development paths. Countries asserting their independence are pushing back against the implicit assumption that Western models are the only valid ones. This challenges not just geopolitical power, but intellectual and moral authority as well. Moreover, the public nature of this challenge is crucial. In the age of instantaneous communication, these declarations are no longer confined to elite diplomatic circles. They resonate globally, inspiring other nations and peoples to rethink their own positions within the international system. It creates a ripple effect where the previously marginalized feel emboldened to assert their interests, their identities, and their critiques of the established order. This phenomenon is not without its risks or contradictions. The dismantling of Western hegemony opens up new spaces of contestation where power struggles intensify and alliances shift unpredictably. Yet, the very fact that this contestation is out in the open transforms the dynamics of global politics. No longer can narratives be managed quietly behind closed doors. They are subject to public scrutiny and debate on an unprecedented scale. In essence, this public challenge to Western hegemony is reshaping the global political landscape. It demands a more honest reckoning with history, power, and justice. It forces us to recognize that the international system has long been a stage for domination masquerading as cooperation. And now that curtain is being pulled back to reveal a new unsettled reality that refuses to conform to old scripts. Language is often seen as a mere tool for communication, a neutral conduit through which ideas travel. But when we peel back the layers, we see that language is far more than a passive vessel. It is a powerful weapon, a strategic instrument wielded in the arena of global politics. In the theatre of diplomacy, language has traditionally been a carefully polished mask, designed to conceal as much as to reveal. Euphemisms, jargon, and artful ambiguity have been the currency of diplomacy, softening the harsh realities of power plays, territorial disputes, and historical injustices. Yet JShankar's bold articulation cuts through this fog of obfuscation, using language not as a shield but as a sword, weaponizing truth itself. What does it mean to wield language as a weapon of truth? It means rejecting the sanitized, diplomatic doublespeak that has long insulated the powerful from accountability. It means speaking in a way that demands attention, that refuses to soften or sugarcoat uncomfortable realities. This kind of language pierces through the carefully constructed narratives that have dominated international relations. It exposes contradictions, hypocrisy, and injustice by naming them plainly. It strips away the layers of polite fiction to reveal the raw, often inconvenient truths underneath. In this context, Language becomes an act of rebellion. It challenges the monopoly that certain actors have had over defining reality. When JShankar speaks with such unfiltered candor, he disrupts the linguistic monopoly held by Western powers, the very monopoly that has shaped global understanding of what is legitimate, what is right, and what is possible. The words become a battlefield where competing histories, values, and visions for the future clash. The weaponization of language here is not about aggression for its own sake. It is about piercing through the veil of deception that diplomacy has long relied upon. This use of language also serves to reclaim agency. For too long, the global south and post-colonial nations have been spoken about rather than spoken with. Their stories have been told by others, often in ways that serve external interests rather than their own truths. By wielding language boldly, JShankar asserts control over the narrative. This is not mere rhetoric. It is a profound political act that shifts power. The ability to articulate grievances, aspirations, and critiques in a clear and unapologetic manner is a declaration that these voices will no longer be marginalized or filtered through the lens of Western sensibilities. Moreover, this kind of linguistic boldness redefines the parameters of diplomatic discourse itself. It challenges the assumption that diplomacy must always be measured, cautious and deferential. Instead, it proposes that honesty, even when uncomfortable or confrontational, can be a path to genuine understanding and change. By weaponizing truth through language, JShankar invites us to reconsider what it means to engage meaningfully in international dialogue. Language as a weapon of truth also disrupts the media narratives that often sanitize or distort global events. When raw, unfiltered statements enter the public sphere, they challenge audiences to confront realities that are otherwise hidden behind spin and propaganda. This forces a reckoning not just among statesmen but among the global public, awakening a collective awareness of the stakes involved in global power dynamics. In essence, the power of language lies not just in what is said, but in how it shatters complacency and demands reckoning. It turns speech from a passive act into an active force that can dismantle lies, illuminate injustice, and open new possibilities for solidarity and resistance. In the grand spectacle of global affairs, the media has long played the role of gatekeeper, the storyteller who crafts narratives that shape public perception and, by extension, political reality itself. For decades, the dominant media outlets, largely concentrated in Western capitals, have wielded immense power, determining which stories are told, how they're framed, and whose voices are amplified or muted. This control over the narrative has been a crucial pillar supporting Western hegemony. But now, this carefully curated media monopoly is being challenged, turned upside down, and in many ways completely flipped on its head. The transformation begins with who controls the story. Traditional media has often been complicit in reinforcing established power structures by recycling official statements, echoing government positions, and framing global events through a narrow lens that prioritizes Western interests and perspectives. But the rise of alternative media, social platforms, and independent voices has cracked this monopoly. Suddenly, the stories that were once sidelined, those of marginalized peoples, dissenting nations, and inconvenient truths, are gaining unprecedented visibility. This diversification of narrative sources challenges the hegemony of a single story and demands a more pluralistic, nuanced engagement with global realities. What's more, the content of these narratives is shifting dramatically. Where once Western media might have portrayed certain countries as perennial victims, rogue states, or peripheral actors, these very nations are now asserting their agency through their own voices and platforms. They contest the reductive caricatures and stereotypes that have long been used to justify interventionist policies or economic sanctions. The narrative is no longer a one-way street where the West defines the story. It is a contested battleground where multiple, often conflicting accounts coexist and compete for legitimacy. This flip in media narratives also involves exposing the selective and often hypercritical nature of coverage. Stories that fit certain political agendas have historically received disproportionate attention, while others, equally critical or even more so, have been ignored or minimized. The selective amplification of crises, the framing of protests as riots depending on who is involved, the uneven scrutiny of allies versus adversaries, all these biases are being challenged openly. This exposure dismantles the illusion of objective, unbiased journalism that many have taken for granted and reveals the media's role as an active participant in power dynamics rather than a neutral observer. The impact of these flipped narratives extends far beyond mere information dissemination. They influence public opinion, policy making, and international relations themselves. When media narratives are diversified and contested, they force governments and institutions to respond to a broader spectrum of perspectives and pressures. This creates a more complex, less predictable political environment where power cannot simply be exercised through narrative control. Additionally, the democratization of narrative control is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allows for greater transparency and accountability. On the other, it opens the floodgates to misinformation, propaganda, and information warfare. Yet, even this chaotic proliferation of narratives reflects the broader geopolitical shifts underway. It underscores the breakdown of old certainties and the emergence of a more fragmented, multipolar world where truth is not a singular, fixed entity, but a contested terrain. This upheaval in media narratives also invites audiences to become more active participants in decoding information. No longer passive consumers, people are increasingly questioning the sources, motives, and contexts behind the news they receive. This critical engagement is reshaping how societies understand themselves and their place in the world, challenging dominant paradigms and opening space for alternative histories and futures. In essence, the flipping of media narratives is not merely about who tells the story, but about who gets to define reality itself. It is a radical shift that unsettles entrenched power structures and invites a more honest, pluralistic conversation about global affairs. For decades, the image of India on the global stage was often that of a cautious, conciliatory player, respectful of the established order, careful not to rock the boat, and frequently framed as a nation still finding its footing amid the giants of global power. The posture was one of polite diplomacy, tempered by a desire to be accepted by the Western-led international community. But this image is shifting dramatically. India's posture today is unmistakably assertive, unapologetic, and confidently self-defined, a reflection of its growing economic strength, strategic ambitions, and a renewed sense of identity rooted in history, culture, and sovereignty. This assertiveness is not mere bravado. It is a carefully calibrated stance that signals India's refusal to be pigeonholed as a passive recipient of global decisions. Instead, India steps onto the world stage with its own agenda, its own priorities, and a clear voice. This is a nation that understands its unique geopolitical position, straddling Asia's power centers, rich in resources, and home to a billion-plus population, and is determined to leverage these strengths without deference to external validation. What marks this transformation most clearly is the way India articulates its interests. Gone are the days of cautious, diluted statements meant to avoid offending powerful allies or antagonizing established powers. Instead, India's leaders and diplomats speak plainly and forcefully about issues that matter, from border disputes and regional security to economic partnerships and global governance reform. This candidness signals a departure from the post-colonial mindset that once sought approval from former colonial masters or dominant Western blocs. India's assertive posture also reflects a broader shift in how it views sovereignty and self-determination. The nation is no longer content to be defined by Cold War alignments or constrained by legacy frameworks of non-alignment and strategic ambiguity. Instead, India embraces a more pragmatic, multipolar approach that allows it to engage flexibly with a variety of partners while safeguarding its autonomy. This flexibility does not translate into weakness. On the contrary, it demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the complexities of 21st century geopolitics. The unapologetic tone extends to India's cultural and historical narratives as well. There is a growing confidence in asserting India's contributions to global civilization, philosophy, and innovation, challenging the Eurocentric narratives that have long overshadowed non-Western histories. This cultural reclamation is intertwined with India's diplomatic assertiveness, as it reinforces a sense of pride and legitimacy that informs how India positions itself internationally. Moreover, India's assertiveness is evident in its response to criticism and challenges. Rather than retreating into defensive apologetics, India confronts disagreements with conviction, framing its actions within the context of its national interests and regional realities. Whether addressing contentious issues like Kashmir, economic policies, or human rights, India now projects resilience and refuses to be cowed by external pressure. This posture also signals India's readiness to assume greater responsibility on the global stage. India is increasingly active in multilateral institutions, peacekeeping missions, climate negotiations, and development initiatives. It is not just a participant, but a driver, advocating for reforms that reflect the changing realities of power and justice in the world order. The assertive posture is not without controversy or complexity. Balancing domestic challenges with international ambitions requires deft navigation. Yet, the clarity of purpose and confidence with which India now engages the world marks a decisive break from a more tentative past. In sum, India's posture today is a declaration, a statement that the nation will no longer be apologetic for its ambitions, its identity, or its role in shaping the future. This is a confident, self-possessed India ready to assert itself unapologetically on its own terms. For decades, diplomacy was synonymous with restraint, a choreography of civility designed to maintain appearances even when beneath the surface conflicts raged and tensions simmered. The age of polite diplomacy was a kind of theatrical performance where words were measured, emotions subdued, and disagreements carefully cloaked in layers of decorum and euphemism. It was the language of compromise often disguised as consensus, and often at the expense of truth or justice. But that era, that carefully maintained illusion of gentlemanly discourse on the international stage, is unequivocally dead. This death is not a dramatic rupture, but a gradual unraveling, accelerated by the complex realities of the 21st century. A century marked by rapid geopolitical shifts, the rise of new powers, and the relentless exposure of hypocrisy and injustice through global media. The old script of polite diplomacy no longer fits the world's messy, urgent, and often deeply polarized conversations. The polite mask have cracked, and behind them, raw, sometimes uncomfortable truths are spilling out. No longer can statesmen afford the luxury of veiled threats or indirect criticisms wrapped in sugar-coated language. The diplomatic dance is becoming more direct, more confrontational, and more authentic. This is partly a response to an impatient global audience that demands clarity and accountability, and partly a reflection of the shifting power dynamics where emerging nations are unwilling to be sidelined or placated with half-truths and vague promises. The death of polite diplomacy also marks a profound shift in how power is exercised. Where once subtlety and indirect influence were prized, today bluntness and forthrightness carry new currency. This does not mean diplomacy has become less sophisticated. Rather, it has evolved into a different kind of sophistication, one that values intellectual honesty and emotional intelligence over mere politeness. Diplomats today must navigate a landscape where silence or evasion can be interpreted as weakness, and where candidness can command respect and reshape alliances. Moreover, the age of polite diplomacy was often a refuge for inequality. It enabled powerful nations to maintain dominance while offering the appearance of dialogue and fairness. But the decline of this era signals a growing unwillingness to accept these imbalances as natural or necessary. Countries now demand to be heard on their own terms, and this demand disrupts the carefully maintained order of diplomatic exchange. This shift also exposes the performative nature of past diplomatic interactions. Many agreements and treaties were less about genuine consensus and more about preserving face and political convenience. The age of polite diplomacy allowed states to pretend to resolve disputes while leaving fundamental issues untouched. Now, with the veneer peeled away, there is space for more honest reckoning, even if that reckoning is uncomfortable or contentious. It is important to recognize that this change is not without risks. The breakdown of polite diplomacy can escalate tensions, breed misunderstandings, and complicate negotiations, but it also opens up possibilities for deeper, more meaningful engagement. When parties speak openly, acknowledging differences rather than glossing over them, the groundwork for genuine solutions rooted in reality rather than illusion can be laid. At its core, the death of polite diplomacy invites us to rethink what diplomacy should be. It challenges the notion that civility requires silence or suppression of critical voices. Instead, it suggests that true diplomacy embraces honesty, even when it disrupts the status quo or unsettles entrenched power structures. This evolution reflects a world in flux, demanding new forms of interaction that are as bold and complex as the challenges they seek to address. The cracks in the old world order reveal a profound transformation, where diplomacy sheds its polite mask and speaks truth with unapologetic boldness. Western dominance faces unprecedented challenges as new voices reshape global narratives and reclaim agency through language and action. India's assertive stance exemplifies this shift, signaling a confident refusal to be sidelined. Media narratives no longer serve as mere instruments of power but arenas of contestation. In this evolving landscape, honesty replaces euphemism and courage supplants caution. This is a moment of upheaval and opportunity, where authentic dialogue can finally confront realities long ignored, redefining the future of international relations.